So in today's video, I'm going to talk about 5 reasons why I think a 24-105 f4 zoom lens is the only lens that you need on your travels. Alright, so reason 1 why a 24-105 is the king of travel comes down to its versatility. So for everyday general capturing of your travels, the range covered by a 24-105 is pretty much impossible to beat, especially when you factor in the fact that this lens is a constant f4 aperture throughout. You of course have the popular wider focal lengths from 24mm to 50mm that are often carried as prime lenses by street photographers or travel photographers. And these are your focal lengths that allow you to capture full wide scenes authentically and show scale in an image. And the longer end of this focal range allows you to crop in and highlight interesting sections of wider scenes that one of those wider primes that I just mentioned, or even a 24-70 on the long end, often will not provide the necessary reach for. I've travelled with a 24-70 and felt often that 70mm just isn't quite long enough, and 105mm just seems to work in a lot more situations. When travelling, you can prepare as much as possible, but a zoom range like this comes in really handy when you just don't know what kind of range you're going to need to capture your subject. For example, today I went on a boat trip and I wanted to capture some images of this island, and I really didn't know how close the boat operator was going to get me to the island. So this lens was just perfect because I could go between 24 to 35 and 50, depending how close I was to the island. And I just had all the range at my fingertips that I needed to capture the perfect shot. And if I'd have taken, say, a 35mm prime to this, then it just wouldn't have had the reach I needed. Alright, here's some practical examples of the huge zoom range that this lens gives you, showing the sheer croppability 24-105mm gives you, and all of those focal lengths that you can play with in between. This lens truly has you covered far and wide, and it is just so nice when you're traveling to not feel in any way inhibited by your lens choice and not having to constantly worry about swapping out prime lenses. And this is a great lens when you're not composition hunting too and are perhaps just documenting the world around you and taking snapshots to look back on and remember your travels. The 24-105 just gets out of the way, and I didn't have to give my lens choice any thought at all when capturing these scenes, whether wandering tight alleyways in Old Town or capturing coastal vistas. There have been many times before I have felt restricted by selecting, say, a 35mm prime. There's something very freeing about a zoom lens like this when traveling in unfamiliar territory. And if you travel with a companion like your wife, girlfriend or boyfriend, for example, and they love photos, then this lens will make them very happy because it is amazing at capturing environmental portraits too. That f4 aperture gives a subtle separation on the wide end, and the tighter focal lengths offer the ability to document from afar and really isolate your subject. So overall, the versatility of this lens and its focal range cannot be understated. There was just never a time where I felt like I needed to go wider than 24mm or crop in more than 105mm, for example. And people will probably be a little bit worried about that f4 aperture, but I can honestly say when looking back through all my images from my travels, there was never a single shot where I thought to myself, I wish I could have shot that at a faster aperture. And that's why I generally choose a 24-105 f4 over a 24-72.8 even. I really prefer the extra range over that slightly faster aperture. And on the subject of environmental portraits, let's move on to reason 2, which is that this lens is an incredible lens for shooting people. So people don't generally suggest an f4 lens like this for portraits, but if you think about it, a 24-105 encompasses all of those classic focal lengths that you would typically associate with portrait photography. On the wide end, you can capture amazing looking environmental portraits, capturing your subject in a scene at say 24, 28 or 35mm, and then simply punch into a popular portrait focal length like 85mm to grab a classic looking head and shoulders portrait, for example, with just the twist of a zoom ring. In my opinion, at 70mm and above, a mid-length portrait shot at f4 has plenty of background blur, and in terms of separation at the wider focal lengths, sure, there's not the kind of 3D pop that you get with a prime, for example, but when traveling, you want to capture the background on these wider environmental portraits. What is the point of traveling hundreds of miles for that beautiful view if you're just going to blur it out and obscure it by shooting at f2 or even 2.8 sometimes is too much in my opinion when shooting environmental portraits where you're capturing a memory, you are traveling and you want to document that. You want the background to be more in focus, or at least I do. So yeah, don't underestimate the portrait lens capabilities of a 24-105. There'll be many fashion and portrait photographers that have built a career off a 24-105 f4, and you're gonna get shots and compositions with this lens that you wouldn't get with say just a 35mm prime. All right, now on to reason number 3, which is adaptability. Now this lens really can adapt to any shooting scenario, and that's not just down to its amazing focal range either. And that's because most 24-105 f4 lenses, and I'll admit I haven't checked all of them, but the Canon RF one that I own, the Lumix L mount one and the Sigma EF mount one also come with built-in lens stabilization. Now lens stabilization helps in a bunch of ways, and one example is that it lets you leave the tripod at home and achieve sharp handheld photos at lower shutter speeds. This means you can capture sharp landscape images at say f10 or f11, and hear me out, it even makes this a great lens in some low light situations too. Yes, I know this lens has a maximum aperture of f4, which is generally far from ideal when it comes to shooting in low light situations, but you'll be surprised how much the added lens stabilization again allows you to leverage longer shutter speeds and keep that ISO lower and still get sharp shots, kind of mitigating the fact that you have that slower aperture. And let's face it, most modern mirrorless cameras like my R6 Mark II perform really well all the way up to 6400 ISO anyway. And now on to reason number 4, which is that this lens makes for a perfect lens for travel video. A 24-105 again covers all the popular focal lengths for video and much more, because this lens excels at capturing footage of people, landscapes and street scenes, whether up close or at range. The built-in stabilization also makes this a great lens for smooth handheld footage and tracking shots in particular. And in my opinion, f4 is the perfect aperture for video. I rarely ever shoot below 2.8 in video ever, but f4 really lends itself to documenting your travels for many of the reasons that we mentioned earlier. You want to capture the full scenes, you get subtle separation, even at the wide end in video, and you still capture the environment around you. But even at f4, you will still need a variable ND filter, and I recently upgraded to the Nisi Swift system, which has just been so useful for travel videography. Being able to add and remove this 4-stop ND filter straight onto the front of the variable ND filter is a game changer for travel where you may be moving from an indoor scene or a dimly lit street into direct sunlight, and I always hated having to unscrew the extra filters. And you'll have seen in my other videos that the Nisi True Color Variable ND has always been my absolute favorite for its true rendition of color and lack of any impact on, say, sharpness at all. When I'm traveling, I avoid having to put my camera down or my camera bag down at all costs, and I hate having to fiddle around with fragile screw-on ND filters. So this Swift filter really did change the game for me when I was traveling this time around. So if you want that cinematic looking footage, an ND filter is a must, and the Nisi Swift system comes highly recommended from me. If you want to learn a little bit more about it, there's a link in the description. And that brings me nicely onto my final reason, and that is that this is the most convenient lens to bring along when traveling. And I say that because a 24-105, despite having such a large zoom range, often having built-in stabilization, and being a high quality optic, is still generally pretty small and lightweight despite all this. This Canon RF lens that I've used for this video, for example, is so comfortable to use on the front of a full frame camera, and the weight is distributed perfectly. You pretty much forget that it's there when you're shooting, and traveling can mean long days hiking in the hot sun, and a zoom like this is easy to pack, whether in a sling or a backpack. Its aforementioned versatility means it replaces the need to bring along a 24, a 35, a 50 and an 85mm prime lens that you would have to bring in its place to cover everything that this lens does. And this saves space in the backpack and the weight on your back too. I've traveled with prime lenses many times and they are great, but traveling with a zoom like this completely negates the need to be putting down your camera bag and swapping out lenses, because that can be less than ideal if you're in a busy city and worried about camera theft or just losing something, or say you're on the side of a mountain and you don't want to be subjecting your sensor to dust and the elements. On my travels, I just had the 24-105 in the side access section of my backpack, and it was just so nice and easy to get in and out when I wanted, and I didn't have to worry about whether I had the right lens attached to my camera at any given point. So yeah, overall to date, those are my reasons why a 24-105 f4 is easily my favorite lens for travel. Yeah, sure, it's not a perfect lens. You are sacrificing a little bit on light transmission with that maximum f4 aperture, but I found it to be just such a fun lens to use that can adapt easily to the unpredictable nature of traveling, and it really just didn't let me down once. Another pro for this lens that I probably should have mentioned earlier is that camera manufacturers commonly include this lens in with a brand new camera body as part of a kit lens deal. So that means if you're after a brand new camera body, then you can often get this lens and the camera body at a slightly discounted rate by buying them in combination with each other. So that's a great option if you're looking to buy a brand new camera system, but that also means that you can often find a 24-105 f4 on the used market at pretty good prices without a box that people have got as a kit lens deal, don't want and put on the used market. So those are my reasons why a 24-105 is the king of travel photography. Let me know down below if you agree or if you don't agree, and let me know what you use for travel. If you use something different, what works for you, let me know down in the comments. I'm also thinking of making a video solely focusing on shooting portraits with a 24-105 f4, so if that's something you're interested in, let me know, and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can see it when it comes out. But anyway, until then, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all soon.